Hello, I'm Nick Clark, bringing you Planet SOS from Palau in the Western Pacific, a beacon in an ocean of change where, despite warming and acidification, coral reefs here are in pristine condition, but the battle to save them is intense. Palau's coral reefs defy the odds. They're stunning and mostly intact for now. But around the world, reefs are being decimated by bleaching events. Here we'll see the pioneering science taking place in the battle against ocean warming and the efforts to conserve coral and fish. The spectacular sight of 2 million golden jellyfish, a unique subspecies threatened by climate change. We'll hear the plight of the 2 million Pacific Islanders facing the peril of the climate crisis. Sea level rise is a global problem. In Europe, we'll speak to those trying to make life on top of the water a reality. Welcome to Planet SOS from one of the front lines of the climate crisis. 1,500 kilometers in that direction lies the Philippines. Papua New Guinea is 1,500 kilometers in that direction. We are surrounded by ocean. Palau is an archipelago of hundreds of islands, a pristine environment with unique biodiversity. But the very thing that has nurtured the people here is now what threatens them and their way of life. Across the globe, oceans are warming, marine life is dying, the waters are steadily rising. And that's a problem for hundreds of millions of people who live on the world's coastlines. Residents of cities like Shanghai, Miami, Lagos, Rio de Janeiro, all threatened. Down the line, unless things improve, we're looking at climate refugees on a massive scale. But it's the Pacific Island nations that are the most threatened and the least heard. Here in Palau, it's not just the people, but the extraordinary ecosystems that are in the firing line. It is an extraordinary sight. Exposed structures of ancient coral reef framed in an expanse of turquoise. The rock islands of Palau, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And beneath the surface, the profusion and variety of life is stunning. One of the highest rates of biodiversity on the planet. But the challenges are numerous. In amongst the jumble of islands, a series of marine lakes hold more wonders. This is Unggul Makato Lake. It is connected to the sea, but only through a series of small cracks and fissures in the rock. It's effectively isolated, a sealed ecosystem, and beneath the surface lies a unique subspecies. Golden jellyfish. They've evolved to harvest energy directly from sunlight. There are more than 2 million of them. And indeed, that's a significant reduction. In the past, there have been as many as 30 million in this lake, but fluctuations in the weather have recently taken their toll.
The biggest challenge that we face in terms of the jellyfish lake is climate change. Very recently, within the past year and a half to 2 years, the golden jellyfish that the site is famous for around the world completely disappeared. Because of climate change, the salinity of the lake rose, so the temperature of the water increased.
As you might expect, the range of biodiversity in Palau is a big tourist draw. There's an estimated 100,000 visitors a year here, 5 times the local population. Above and below water, the sites are carefully monitored. Everyone has to buy a permit. And regulation applies too to the fishing industry. These rangers are on the lookout for illegal fishing in protected so-called no-take zones, implemented to try and conserve dwindling fish species along the coast, which are targeted by unscrupulous foreign vessels.
For the commercial fishermen that illegal fish here, it's usually have big ships, mother-ships, so it's everything from giant clams to sea urchins to sea cucumbers to fish.
And from next year, the marine protected area will be massively extended into the open ocean, which will restrict some catches like this, tuna bound for Japan.
But come 2020, all these vessels can only be fishing that 20% of the water. And the reason for that is that we want to make sure that 80% of no-take to ensure the sustainability of this important resource. We're seeing that when we do give area, a refuge, a conservation area, you can see as 5 times as much fish in an area that's open.
There is another ultimately overriding concern. not just on Palau, but for the 2 million islanders across the Pacific. Sea level rise. Ken Zero has lived here for decades, and he says full moon tides are getting higher and higher, and that can have a devastating effect.
I lived here for like more than 40 years, I would say. And this is the first time I've seen this kind of high tide coming in. It's hard because you have to find another place to move to. And if you don't have the money to build a new house, then you won't be able to do that. So people are pretty much stuck.
The wonders of this part of the Pacific are many, but so too are the pressures. Palau is standing tough when it comes to environmental protections, but its people are going to need all the resolve they can muster in the coming years. Now then, Palau's president is a veteran campaigner on the world stage, fighting to protect island nations while there's still time. Let's hear now what President Tommy Remengesau had to say when he addressed world leaders at the UN General Assembly in September.
Palau has some of the most well-preserved coral reef ecosystems in the world. However, we now face many challenges brought on by a globalized world. Today, local fishermen are not the only ones trolling our waters, and climate crisis threatens to render island lives and livelihoods untenable.
Well, I interviewed the president here and first asked him more about the pressures that Palau is facing from climate change.
Every full moon now, that means every month, we have households along the coastline that literally have to abandon their places and go in and stay the weekend or a couple of days until the full moon tide resides. That's how serious it is. You can't park in your own backyard anymore. So sea level rise is a dramatic thing. Salt water is seeping into our agricultural farm, so it's affecting food security too. And of course, the biggest threats are the frequency of storms and natural disasters, typhoons. You can see today, this is supposed to be a dry month, but here we are, we're going through storms after storms.
For people living away from the Pacific and away from the front line here, it's very hard for them to make the connection with how serious the climate crisis is. What would you say to them?
We're small, but we're the window to what can eventually happen to the rest of the world. We're small, but the actions that we're taking here can also have a scale-up value to what the world needs to do in order to ensure humankind is here for the next generation. Believe me, this is something that's going to catch like a wildfire. And we are on the beginning of that wildfire, but eventually it will spread.
So Donald Trump has now started the process of pulling out of the Paris Agreement. What do you make of that?
We're not going to flinch about this. You know, it's a lost opportunity for the United States. A lot of these things could have been accomplished more, faster, and meaningful if the capability of the U.S. would have been there, along with China, the Europe, and all the the leading countries. But it's a sad thing because it's, again, I think it's economics over real matters.
So when you wrap up here at the office, and when you go home, and you sit on your veranda and look out to sea, what goes through your mind? Do you have room for optimism?
If I don't have some hope, it'll be the worst feeling of any human being. So I have to retain some sense of hope. I have to think that there is still time, that there are solutions, and that everything will come together. That's the hope that I'm getting.
We're heading out to the coral reefs now, and later in the program we'll learn more about the extensive science going on here in Palau. But first, what's the world doing about rising sea levels and the prospect of millions of people displaced? For more, let's cross to Mariana in Doha.
Thanks, Nick. Our planet is around 1 degree Celsius warmer than pre-industrial times, and scientists say we're on track to go up by another ½ degree by 2030 and surpass that if greenhouse gas emissions keep going up. Now, half a degree may not sound like much, but the UN's body dealing with the science on climate change, the IPCC, says it will cause subtle but significant shifts in long-term weather patterns. So drawing on the work of analysts at Carbon Brief, here's an insight into what half a degree means. There's a 10% chance of an Arctic summer without ice at least once before we hit a 1.5 degree rise. And you can take that up to an 80% chance before a 2 degree rise. The number of people exposed to severe drought will go up on average by more than 130 million with a 1.5 degree rise and almost 200 million at 2 degrees. And the number of people flooded in coastal areas is projected to go up by at least 28 million people every year by 2055 in a 1.5 degree world, and 30 million each year with a 2 degree rise. Half a degree will kill between 70 and 90% of the world's coral, scientists predict, and squeeze by half the habitats of 6% of insects, creating a cascade of negative effects. For millions of people worldwide, a 1 degree Celsius rise in global temperature is already an emergency. Forced from their homes by crop failures, floods, fires, extreme weather and rising seas. Al Jazeera's Heidi Zhou-Castro travelled to the Alaskan coastal village of Newtok, where 350 native Alaskans are having to move.
2,000 years ago, the Yupik people began sheltering in the embrace of the Ninglek River to endure Alaska's winters. For millennia, the water brought food and life, but now it brings destruction. Albertina Charles was born in the village of Newtok, like her ancestors before her, but the land is slipping away beneath her feet.
It used to be further down, like 20 feet, maybe.
Yeah.
Now it's right there.
Sea level rise, stronger storms, and melting permafrost is putting an end to human civilization on this patch of the Alaskan tundra. About 25 meters of land crumbles away each year. Everything man builds collapses atop the melting ground. The garbage landfill is now underwater, so too the boat dock. And soon, Charles's home will also teeter over the edge.
We'll sink. That's what the elders always say. Soon the village is going to sink.
So the whole village of 350 people is moving to higher ground. Newtok was among the first communities in the world to recognize the dangers of our warming planet. Even in the 1990s, the Tribal Council knew it was in a race against time. And after decades of planning, finally, the day to move has arrived. We're on our way now to Newtok's future. 15 kilometers from the old village, atop solid volcanic rock, a new village is under construction. It will be called Murtavik, meaning getting water from the spring in the Yupik language.
Start loading your stuff off when we put a number on it.
Thanks to an early start and persistence, Newtok believes it will complete the village relocation in 2 years.
The elders and everything on the village council wanted everybody to stay together, because what you're really talking about is dislocating people.
The new village had to be close to Yupik hunting grounds. Along with houses, the people need roads, a power plant, clinic, and school. The entire project costs around $100 million. Money difficult to secure from the government because laws written to address sudden natural disasters never envisioned the slow catastrophe of climate change.
There's other communities that are right in line. You know, our brothers and sisters west, there's a lot more communities that are just looking for a way right to grants and everything like that, you know, for this type of disaster.
Albertina Charles is among the first people to go, and she's excited, but the moment is also bitter.
I'm going to miss this place. This is where I was born, this is where I grew up.
Her life and the life of her village is now pioneering forward into a new era of the Earth's changing climate. Heidi Zhou-Castro, Planet SOS, Newtok, Alaska.
So $100 million to shift 350 people. Imagine then the cost, both financially and emotionally, of finding refuge for, say, 350 million climate refugees, even more. That's what scientists say could happen if we fail to act. Now, limiting warming to a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise, or well below 2, is what nations signed up to in Paris. But those numbers weren't chosen because they're what's best for the planet. They were chosen because that's what nations could agree on. And the pledges, well, they were never going to be enough anyway. A report by the Universal Ecological Fund shows that even if countries delivered on every single pledge from Paris, the average global temperature would rise by around 3.5 degrees. The IPCC says we need to halve global greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 to stick to a 1.5 degree rise. But to do that, nations must commit to new, much more ambitious pledges. And in the years since Paris, levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have in fact gone up. Back to you, Nick.
All right, well, let's get more on what's going on down below in this stunning environment. In a minute, we're going to communicate from the seabed to the boat because there's a whole load of ocean science taking place here in Palau. And our reporter, Oliver Varney, has joined the team. And while they sort themselves out down on the reef, let's just take a look at this report that Oliver compiled earlier.
Palau's seas are teeming with life, most of it concentrated here on the country's barrier reef. Stretching over 500 kilometres, it's one of the planet's few remaining pristine coral reefs. But this beauty comes with a fragility.
It may have one of the most pristine reefs in the world, but the entire ecosystem here is under threat.
Around the world, coral reefs are disappearing at an alarming rate. It's estimated over a third of all reefs will be destroyed or seriously damaged within the next 10 years. Climate change is warming seas, which has a devastating effect on corals, forcing them to eject the colourful algae that normally lives within them and bleaching them white. Much of the reef here in Palau has been spared, and that's in part because of the geography of the region. Water trapped by the lushly forested limestone cliffs forms a sort of lagoon and warms in the sun. But instead of getting bleached, the coral here has adapted to these extreme conditions and remains healthy. These are so-called supercorals, and they only exist here in the Western Pacific, and that makes them fascinating for scientists, who hope they can be used to repair damaged reefs around the world.
We bring the corals to the lab and then we stress them, increase the temperature of the water that they're in, and to see which of them are surviving. And those would be our heat-tolerant corals.
The efforts that scientists are making here show the healthy reef supports millions of species, and on the edge of the reef in the fast-flowing currents, sharks.
There are 130 different species of sharks and rays in these deep waters here off the coast of Palau, and over half of those are endangered. In order to protect them, Palau created the world's first shark sanctuary. There are strict laws in place, and anyone caught fishing for sharks or rays faces tough penalties.
However, it's a lucrative business. Shark fins fetch big money in the markets of Asia, where they're used in shark fin soup. We've only been in the water for a few minutes when we come across this, a grey reef shark missing its dorsal fin. These illegal fishing vessels catch sharks, hack their fins off, and then toss the rest of the fish, still alive, back into the sea. The prospects for this shark are bleak. Without a fin to keep it upright, it'll soon tire, sink to the bottom of the ocean and die. As climate change decimates coral reefs and fish bear the scars of humans' greed, Palau's turquoise waters and the secrets they contain are a small beacon of hope in a vanishing underwater world.
All right, now let's establish contact with the team. If we toss this transducer into the water, we should be able to make a connection with Oliver. Oliver, tell us more about what you're seeing down there.
Hi Nick, yes, I'm with a group of scientists who are studying supercorals. Acidification occurs when the ocean absorbs more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that's bad for corals and other creatures, as it makes it harder to build the skeletons and shells that they need to survive. By collecting samples of supercorals and breeding them in the lab, scientists hope to create a strain of coral that is incredibly resilient to either higher temperatures or more acidic seas. They could then transplant them in reefs around the world, which have more fragile strains of coral that can't survive as the oceans change.
All right, thanks a lot, Oliver. Not often you get to hold a conversation like that. Now, there's all sorts of science going on in all corners of the world, critical research in these uncertain times. One of the data points you see there is the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Scientists say the safe level is anything below 350, but we are well past that at above 400 parts per million. The reason is excess carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are acting like a blanket around the Earth, not allowing excess heat to escape to the atmosphere and causing the global temperature to rise. So we wouldn't have any direct evidence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere if it wasn't for Charles Keeling. Back in 1958, he began monitoring CO2 levels, a measurement now known as the Keeling curve. He painstakingly recorded CO2 levels every day for decades, and that's a job his son Ralph has now taken over.
My father came to Scripps in, I think, 1956 with the task of measuring carbon dioxide at different places around the world. In 1958, he was getting readings of around 310 parts per million. Now we're up at, almost approaching 415 parts per million, 410 or more. So it's just really rocketing up. The main operation in my lab, as in my father's lab, involved sending flasks, these are glass spheres, out into the field that are filled with an air sample and sent back, and then we analyze it in the lab. It established as a matter of fact that humans were impacting the planet at a global scale. The core problem is the burning of fossil fuels. We're burning more and more decade by decade. It's not like we understand this problem and are starting to curtail. It's like you've got a weight problem and your response is to eat more and more. You have to go back millions of years before you find levels as high as today. And that was a world with a very different climate. I think what's really changed in the last decade in particular is people starting to feel the weirdness of the climate around them in terms of freak weather and crop failures, and so it's lost some of its remoteness. It's starting to creep into people's lives. I think it's going to get kind of rough, to be honest, and I don't see how we get around this without serious consequences, and the sooner we understand what we're facing and start adapting to it and reducing the problem, the better off we'll be, and sadly it's taken a long time to get there.
Well, now we're back in the capital, Koror, in the neighbourhood that we featured earlier, where the issue of rising sea levels is almost a daily problem for people living here, as it is for a growing number of communities right around the world. Well, in the Netherlands, which is one of the planet's lowest lying countries, they're using age-old technology to explore the possibility of life on the water. Here's Natasha Butler.
Amsterdam is a city defined by water. Tall homes line its famous canals. But in this neighbourhood, people don't just live near water, they live on it. Paul Vlok runs architectural tours of the area. He says living on water comes naturally to the Dutch because the Netherlands is one of the world's lowest lying countries.
For almost 1,000 years we build dikes and create land. It's in our DNA to live with the water. And with all technical possibilities nowadays and the climate change, we find new ways to make neighbours on the water.
Because of climate change, global sea levels are rising. A quarter of the population in the Netherlands lives below sea level, so these homes are a laboratory for the future. Viggo Huffink's floating home is an enticing haven of shimmering light. He helped design it after coming up with a plan for a sustainable community with friends a decade ago.
The world needs to change. We can't keep doing the same thing that we've been doing the last 100 years. I think everybody knows that. And we wanted to make a statement and show that it's doable.
Floating houses may seem like a luxury, but architects say that floating structures can be adapted according to budget and need. So low-cost homes, schools, hospitals, even entire cities could one day be built on water. In Rotterdam's port, there's a floating farm powered by solar energy. Farms like this could be replicated in poorer parts of the world that are susceptible to rising waters.
When you are on a floating farm, you go up and down with the flooding or as we do here in the port, we go up and down with a tide. So you can still go on with food production no matter how high the water level is.
Kern Oldhus has designed floating apartment blocks, ports and cities and hundreds of homes. One of the world's leading experts in floating architecture, he says climate change creates a sense of urgency.
Now we've been working on this kind of technology and ideas and architecture for the last 15 years, but we really think that there's momentum now, because climate change is bigger than ever, urbanization is bigger than ever, and we think that water can be a solution because it gives space, it gives flexibility, and it's quite sustainable.
Building on water doesn't tackle the root causes of climate change, but it can provide a creative and sustainable solution to one of the greatest challenges of our time. Natasha Butler, Amsterdam, the Netherlands.
Floating architecture, one way of dealing with rising sea levels. We'd like to hear your stories of innovation and solutions. You can get in touch using the hashtag AJPlanetSOS. Well, that's just about it from Palau in the Western Pacific, this extraordinary country full of life fighting for its future. Next time on the show, we'll bring you what's coming up at COP25. That's the annual climate gathering of scientists, politicians and civil society. It's now in Madrid, of course, after Chile pulled out. But from me, Nick Clark, and the rest of the Planet SOS team here in Palau, it's goodbye for now.